Hi, my name's Isabelle Hart, 24 years old, and my master's graduation in finance at UC Berkeley was supposed to be one of the proudest moments of my life. But right in the middle of the celebration dinner, when everyone was still raising their glasses, my mother suddenly set down her wine and said bluntly, "Lily's about to start medical school. She needs a place near the hospital. Sign over the Oakland apartment to her, will you?" That apartment wasn't something my parents had bought. It was the last gift my maternal grandparents left me, a safe place, a piece of inheritance tied to the love and trust they had in me. My father, cold as ever, added, "You have a career already. Don't be selfish. Family needs to know how to share." Instead of arguing, I simply smiled and said, "Understood." But what they didn't know was that the very next morning, the trust would be updated, every lock replaced, and all the old keys rendered useless. Have you ever been asked to give up something that belonged to you just to meet someone else's needs? If you have, then you'll understand why I did what I did. And before I tell you the whole story from that graduation dinner to the moment they stood at the apartment door with their suitcases in hand but couldn't get in, I want to know, where are you listening from right now? Leave a comment below, because I believe that no matter where you are, this story will reach you. I am the eldest child, and ever since Lily, my younger sister, was born, my place in the family slowly faded into the background. Lily was always the one who needed support, the center of everyone's attention. From a very young age, I understood that in this family, I was not the priority. That feeling didn't come from one single moment, but from countless small details repeated throughout my childhood. The first time I truly realized it was on my 8th birthday. I had been looking forward for a whole month to receiving the silver-blue bicycle I always stared at through the shop window on my way home from school. That day, I opened the big gift box sitting in the middle of the dining table, my heart pounding, and inside was indeed that very bicycle, but it wasn't for me. My mother smiled brightly, turned to Lily, who was only 6 then, and said, "You're too grown up for a new bike. You can use the old one. This one is for your sister, so she can start elementary school." I forced a smile, but inside I felt as if someone had just pulled all the air out of my lungs. Moments like that didn't happen just once. When I was in 10th grade, I earned a summer scholarship to a youth finance program at Stanford, something I had spent months preparing my application for. The scholarship covered all expenses and even left a little extra for me to buy reference books. But my parents said that the extra money would be better used to invest in Lily's piano lessons because art will open more opportunities. I still attended Stanford, but that whole summer, every time I opened a book I had bought with money from my part-time job instead of from my scholarship reward, I felt a small cut inside, not painful enough to make me cry, but always quietly bleeding. The relationship between my mother and me gradually grew cold, not because of the times I had gifts or money taken away, but because of the constant comparisons. Every time I reacted or showed disagreement, she would say, in a tone as if it were an undeniable truth, "You're stronger. Lily needs to be supported. You're independent, but she's not." On the surface, it sounded like a compliment, but underneath was a different message. I don't need, and therefore, I will not receive. Over time, I learned to keep silent, swallowing my frustrations just to avoid another lecture about selflessness or the role of the eldest sister. The only people in the family who truly saw and acknowledged my efforts were my maternal grandparents. They lived in Alameda, just a short ferry ride from Oakland, and every time I visited, it felt like I could finally breathe real air. My grandfather would sit at the dining table, sipping tea and asking me about my classes, about plans I hadn't dared to share with anyone else. My grandmother often packed me chicken sandwiches, slipping a few bills into my pocket to buy books or something you like. Don't tell your mother. By the time I entered college, my grandparents' health began to decline. I still made time to visit them on weekends, helping with shopping and tidying up the house. In those sunlit afternoons in their living room, my grandfather often repeated the same words. "Wherever you go, whatever you do, remember you must have a safe place of your own. A place no one can take away from you." Back then, I didn't think he was referring to the Oakland apartment, but when they passed away, I understood. They had left that apartment in a trust with me as the sole beneficiary. Not to my mother, not to Lily, not to anyone else in the family, only to me. On the day the lawyer read the will and explained the trust in detail, I saw the flicker of discomfort in my mother's eyes. She forced a smile, but her voice was strained. "Well, at least you have a place to live." I knew she wasn't pleased that full ownership rested entirely with me, and even less pleased when the lawyer made it clear my parents had no legal rights to the apartment, even though they still held a set of keys. They claimed it was to help in case of need, but I knew all too well sometimes help was just another way to control. From that moment on, the apartment became my territory, the one place where I felt truly protected from the whirlpool of family favoritism. I could lock the door and know no one had the right to enter without my permission. I could cook, play music, leave my study materials scattered across the table without fear of judgment. But deep down, I still wish that one day my parents would come here, not to ask for the keys or to talk about sharing the apartment, but simply to say one plain sentence: "We're proud of you." On the morning of my graduation, I woke up very early. The faint light of dawn filtered through the curtains of my Oakland apartment, casting a soft glow on the gown and cap I had hung up the night before. I had pictured this moment hundreds of times in my head, walking across the stage at the Greek theater, hearing my name ring out in applause, looking down at the audience and seeing my family smiling with pride. I wanted to believe that today would be different, that my parents would set everything about Lily aside for one day, just to be fully present for me. I drove to Berkeley and parked in the lot near the open-air venue. The Greek theater was packed to capacity, more than 8,000 seats filled. The air buzzed with lively chatter, the constant click of cameras going off. I found my parents in the audience. My mother wore a navy blue dress, my father in a gray suit. But instead of asking how I felt or offering congratulations, the first thing my mother said was, "You know, Lily's about to graduate from college. We need to get everything ready for her to start medical school. We have to plan now." My father nodded in agreement, adding, "We'll have to sort out housing, tuition, internship expenses. She's going to be so busy, so we'll need to take care of everything." I forced a smile, swallowing the words, "Today's my day," before they could leave my lips. When my turn came, the announcer's voice rang out. "Isabelle Hart, Master of Finance, summa cum laude." I stepped onto the stage, accepted my diploma from the dean, and heard cheers from a group of friends and colleagues in the distance. My parents clapped too, but I could see it clearly in their eyes. The pride didn't burn as brightly as when they spoke about Lily. When the ceremony ended, we took a few photos together, and then my father was quick to say, "Come on, let's go eat. We have a lot to discuss." How? That evening, I chose an Italian restaurant by Lake Merritt, just about a 10-minute drive from my apartment. It was a place I had been to a few times with friends, warm yet elegant, with golden light spilling over wooden tables, the scent of toasted bread and tomato sauce filling the air. I wanted this dinner to be beautiful, a perfect punctuation mark to the long, grueling journey of my studies. Close friends, a few colleagues from my internship, and my family were all there. We clinked glasses of red wine, laughed, and reminisced about moments on campus. The appetizers had just been served, and I was still chatting with Sarah, my best friend, when my mother suddenly set her wine glass down, straightened up, and spoke in a tone so serious that the conversation around us faded into silence. "We need to talk about the apartment." I froze for a moment. "The apartment?" My mother nodded and continued. "Lily's about to start medical school. She needs a place near the hospital where she'll be doing her internship. Your apartment in Oakland is the perfect location. Sign it over to her, will you?" The words landed on the table like a heavy stone. I saw my friends glance at me, then at each other, their expressions confused. I tried to keep my voice steady. "You know that apartment was left to me by my grandparents, and it's in a trust." "Why would—" My mother cut me off, her tone light but unyielding. "You already have a career. You'll earn plenty more. Your sister needs a start." My father added, his voice cold as ice. "Don't be selfish, Isabelle. This is family. Family knows how to share." It was as if all the sounds in the restaurant faded away. All that remained was the faint clink of cutlery from the next table, the soft hum of Italian music in the corner, and the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I looked around the table. Sarah frowned, clearly biting back a reaction. One of my colleagues shook her head slightly. Lily sat quietly, eyes fixed on her phone, as if the whole thing had nothing to do with her. In that moment, I knew I could stand up and walk out, or I could argue it to the end. But I also knew that anything I said now would be twisted into, "You're being disrespectful," or "You don't value family." So, instead, I simply set my glass down, looked directly at my parents, and said one word, "Understood." Then I smiled faintly, as if the matter was settled. The dinner went on in a strange atmosphere, no more lively laughter, just safe, polite small talk. I sat there, taking small bites, listening to them discuss how Lily would decorate the apartment, what color the walls would be, where to buy the furniture. It was as if the decision had already been made long ago, and I was merely the one to sign a paper they had ready. I didn't question it, didn't respond, but deep inside, a door had quietly closed. When the cake arrived, instead of a toast in my honor, my mother announced to everyone, "Isabelle is helping her sister get a solid start by giving her the apartment." I heard a few people murmur in surprise, some even saying, "That's wonderful, what a model older sister." I just smiled, blew out the candles, and said nothing more. But in my mind, I already knew exactly what I was going to do the next morning. I drove back to my apartment in silence. The road from the restaurant by Lake Merritt to Oakland usually took just 10 minutes, but tonight, each streetlight, each curve in the road seemed to stretch longer, as if trying to delay my arrival and prolong the uneasy feeling rising inside me. I parked in the underground garage, turned off the engine, but stayed there for a few minutes, my hands still resting on the steering wheel. The apartment upstairs, the four walls I had considered my safe fortress, for years suddenly didn't feel as untouchable as it once had. I remember a summer afternoon when I was 17, sitting with my grandfather on the balcony of my grandparents' home in Alameda. He was gazing out over the water, his voice slow and deliberate. "Isabelle, don't let anyone take what already belongs to you, not just your property, but your respect." At the time, I thought he was simply teaching me to take care of my belongings or to protect myself. Only now do I understand he was speaking of things much deeper, greater, and far harder to defend. I stepped into my apartment, turned on the lights, and that familiar warmth rushed out to greet me, the scent of old books, the wood of the shelves, the lavender from the diffuser on the kitchen counter. This was the place where I had laughed, cried, worked through the night, and sometimes just sat silently by the window watching the streets below, reminding myself I wasn't completely adrift. And yet, in the span of one evening, my parents had made it feel like a commodity, something they could transfer at will. I kicked off my shoes, walked straight to the bedroom, and opened the closet. In the far corner, behind a row of suitcases, was a small black safe, the code to which only my grandparents and I had ever known. I turned the dial, listened to the faint click of the mechanism inside, and swung the door open. Inside was the copy of the trust the lawyer had given me when the inheritance was finalized, along with a folder of other legal documents. I picked up the trust, sat down on the bed, and spread it out before me. The bold text stood out clearly. Beneficiary: Isabelle Hart, sole ownership. No transfer without written consent of the beneficiary. I read it at least 3 times, as if to carve into my memory the fact that this ownership was mine entirely. My parents couldn't force me to sign over the deed, couldn't legally compel me to give it to Lily. But that didn't mean they wouldn't try something else. I knew all too well how they operated, not always head-on, but always skillful enough to corner me into a fait accompli. They still had a set of keys. And if they wanted, they could drop by at any time, bringing Lily and a few boxes, and quietly turn this into her place. They'd call it temporary, but I knew that in my family, temporary could last a lifetime. I pictured myself coming home from work, opening the door to find Lily sprawled on the couch with her books scattered across the table, my mother cooking in the kitchen, my father pacing the balcony on the phone as if I were just a guest in my own apartment. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I picked up my phone, about to call Sarah to let it all out, but then I stopped. I didn't need comfort right now. I needed a plan. I laid the trust on the table and pulled out the envelope containing the property management agreement my lawyer had given me last year. I began reading through each clause again, marking the sections about access rights, the ability to change key holders, and the authority to deny any form of use without my written consent. I knew I had to act immediately, before my parents had a chance to turn those dinner table words into action. They were used to my silence, convinced that if they pushed hard enough, I would give in. But this time, I wasn't the 8-year-old who lost her bike, or the 16-year-old whose scholarship money was reallocated. This time, I was the sole decision-maker, and I was not going to let anyone touch what my grandparents had entrusted to me with their full faith. I folded the documents, carefully placed them into my portfolio, and set it on the table by the front door. Tomorrow, before they could do anything, I would meet with my lawyer. And if necessary, I would replace every lock, change the security code, and update the trust to ensure no one but me could walk through that door. The thought steadied my heartbeat and evened my breathing. I knew storms were coming, angry calls, accusations, but this time I was ready. When I switched off the lights and lay down in bed, I looked out the window. The city lights reflected off the distant lake, and I thought of my grandparents. In my head, I whispered to them, as if speaking directly, "I'll keep it. No one will take it away." And for the first time all day, I smiled a small smile, but enough to remind me I was still in control. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, despite a restless night. The early light filtered through the curtains, illuminating the trust papers I had set by the door. I brewed a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen counter, and stared at each page as if they could magically transform into a shield to protect me from my parents' intentions. But I knew paper was just paper, until I acted. I pulled out my phone and found the number for Mr. Harris, the lawyer who had handled all the inheritance paperwork for the apartment after my grandparents passed away. His office was in downtown Oakland, just a 10-minute drive from my place. I called, and luckily, he had an opening at 9 a.m. His voice was as steady and clear as the day we first met. "Bring all the documents with you. We'll get this resolved today." The morning air in Oakland was still crisp. I parked near the office building, clutching the folder of documents as I walked quickly inside. Mr. Harris's office was on the 3rd floor, bright with glass-paneled doors, lined wall-to-wall with bookshelves, and faintly scented with polished wood. He stood to shake my hand, his gaze both probing and resolute. "Isabelle, tell me what happened." I sat down and recounted the entire evening before, from the moment my mother abruptly demanded I sign over the apartment to Lily, to the single word "understood" I said just to keep the peace, to my fear that my parents would use their keys to let themselves in. Mr. Harris nodded, then opened the folder I had brought. "Legally, they have no rights to this apartment. But you're correct, keeping the keys is a loophole. You can close it immediately in 2 steps. Update the trust to revoke all access rights and replace every lock, including the security system." He pulled a blank set of forms from his drawer and began drafting an addendum. I read each line carefully. "All access rights to the property at address are hereby restricted solely to Isabelle Hart. Any individual not expressly named as the beneficiary or designated in writing shall be considered an unlawful intruder." I signed my name on the spot, my pen strokes firm and decisive. Mr. Harris gave me a faint smile. "I'll file this update with the property registry today. But I recommend you change the locks before they have a chance to react." I nodded and immediately called an emergency locksmith. They promised to arrive at my apartment within 2 hours. As I left the office, Mr. Harris added, "I'll send an official email to your parents, notifying them that all access rights have been revoked. We'll also keep a record of the timestamp for legal purposes, should it be necessary later." I thanked him, feeling part of the weight lift off my shoulders. Back at the apartment, I met the locksmith at the door, a middle-aged man with a large toolbox, quick and efficient in his work. He removed all the old locks and installed a new electronic system with both a keypad code and keycard entry. I registered a code only I knew and created a spare keycard for Sarah, the one person I trusted most. The security system was also upgraded: door sensors, a video doorbell, and a phone app that let me monitor everything remotely. While the locksmith worked, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Mr. Harris, CCing me on the notice sent to my parents. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Hart, pursuant to the addendum to trust number, effective as of today, all of your access rights to the property have been revoked. All existing keys are now void. Entry to this property without the written consent of the beneficiary will be considered unlawful trespass and may be subject to legal action. I read every word, feeling a clarity and finality I hadn't experienced in a long time. I pictured my parents opening that email certain they would call me immediately, or at the very least send a long, accusatory message. But all morning, my phone stayed silent. Maybe they were stunned. Maybe they were already planning their next move. Either way, this time, I had acted first. By midday, when the locksmith left, I stood in the doorway, looking at the new door with its sleek electronic keypad glowing green. A complete sense of security settled over me. This apartment was no longer just a living space, it was a tangible boundary for my self-respect. And now, that boundary was reinforced. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, then opened my laptop. I updated the trust with a short list of people authorized to enter. Besides me and Sarah, no one else. I also set up instant alerts every time the door opened. I would know immediately. No more surprise drop-ins, no more risk of coming home to find someone else occupying my space. When everything was done, I sat down on the sofa, leaned back, and closed my eyes. Every step I'd taken that morning wasn't just to protect an asset, it was to assert that I was no longer someone who could be pushed around. In my mind, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice. A safe place of your own. And I knew that today, I had done exactly what he wanted. That afternoon, I was sitting on the sofa reviewing a project contract from work when the alert from my security app chimed on my phone. The door camera showed my parents standing outside the apartment, with Lily just behind them, holding a large cardboard box. At their feet were 2 medium-sized suitcases, clear evidence they intended to move in right away. I glanced at the clock. Just after noon. They had likely finished lunch and come straight here, probably assuming I was out and wouldn't be able to stop them. I didn't rush to the door. Instead, I watched the feed as my father pulled out a key, inserted it into the lock, then paused, frowning when it wouldn't turn. He tried again, more forcefully, but the electronic lock only gave a sharp beep indicating an incorrect code. My mother crouched down to try a different key. No luck. They began talking to each other in irritated tones, while Lily stayed quiet, avoiding the camera's gaze. After a few seconds, my mother looked straight into the doorbell lens and pressed the button. I tapped the intercom. My voice carried outside, steady and clear. The trust has been updated. The official notice has been sent to your email. I don't owe anyone this apartment. My mother pulled out her phone to check, and there was a brief silence, as if they needed a moment to process what I had just said. Then my father spoke first, his tone sharp. Isabelle, what the hell are you doing? This is your family. We agreed at dinner last night that you'd give Lily this apartment. I kept my voice calm, but every word was firm. No, you stated your intention. That's not an agreement. I never said yes. And now I've made sure no one can take it. My mother cut in, her voice rising. You're so ungrateful. We raised you, paid for your education, and now you turn your back on us and destroy family ties over an apartment. I took a deep breath, keeping my tone from shaking. Family ties can't be built on coercion. If they only exist when I give up what's mine, then they're not real. On the other end of the intercom, I heard my father exhale sharply, followed by my mother unleashing a string of accusations. You're selfish. You always think you're right. You're leaving your sister with nothing. Lily said something faintly, but her voice was too soft for me to catch. I answered only this. I hope you understand this isn't a decision against the family. It's a decision to protect the legal rights and the respect my grandparents gave me. I won't argue further. Any future communication, if necessary, should go through my lawyer." Then I pressed the button to end the conversation. From the camera feed, I saw my mother shake her head, say something to my father, and then the two of them began gathering up the suitcases and box. Lily stepped back, glancing up at the camera once before turning away. They left the hallway, walking quickly toward the elevator. I didn't know what their next move would be: an angry phone call, a long accusatory email, or an attempt to rally relatives into the matter, but I knew I had just sent a clear message. This door, both literally and figuratively, was closed to them when it came to controlling my life. When the camera screen returned to an empty hallway, I leaned back into the sofa. There was no loud rush of triumph, just a heavy, steady quiet. I had held my boundary, and this time they couldn't bend it with a few commanding words or my silence. Somewhere inside, there was still a trace of sadness after all. They were still my parents and my sister, but it wasn't strong enough to pull me back. I had chosen to protect myself, and I knew that no matter what kind of family storm was brewing somewhere out there, I would stand firm. 3 days later, my parents called me, their voices trying for calm but edged with tension. They said they wanted to sit down and talk things through at a neutral cafe halfway between Oakland and Walnut Creek. I agreed, partly to bring closure, partly because I knew I couldn't avoid this conversation forever. The cafe sat on a quiet street corner, its wide glass windows looking out at rows of maple trees with leaves beginning to change color. I arrived 10 minutes early, choosing a table in the corner with my back to the wall so I could see the whole room. A cappuccino steamed in front of me, but I didn't drink, just stirred it slowly, passing the time. When they walked in, I could see both of them dressed neatly, as if for an important meeting. My mother in a crisp white blouse, my father wearing a dark blue tie. Lily wasn't with them. They sat down, and after a few strained pleasantries, my mother began. "Isabelle, we think we can find a middle ground. It doesn't need to be this tense. All you have to do is let Lily stay temporarily in the apartment until she's settled in med school. She won't change anything, won't touch your things. We're family, we help each other in tough times." My father added, "We'll cover her utilities and living expenses. You just need to let her use the address for a while." "Oh." I set the spoon down and looked them straight in the eye. I spent my entire childhood catering to my sister's needs. When I was little, my gifts were swapped so she could have them. As I got older, my scholarship money was taken so she could have piano lessons. When I went to college, I had to fend for myself while she had everything provided for her. I'm used to sacrificing, but this apartment is different. This is my boundary. It's not something that can be shared, and I will not allow anyone but myself and the person I choose to have the right to live there." My mother frowned. "You're exaggerating. This is only a temporary situation." I shook my head. "There's no such thing as temporary in our family. Once she moves in, I won't have a home anymore, and you both know that." My father leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower. "You're being selfish, Isabelle. An apartment isn't meant to sit there on display. It's a family asset." I answered instantly, my voice firm. It's my asset. My grandparents left it to me, placed it in a trust under my name. The family has no legal right and no moral right to demand I give it up." The air grew thick. The coffee machine at the counter hissed and clicked, but at our table, there was only the sound of heavy breathing. Finally, my mother spoke, almost through clenched teeth. "If that's your decision, then don't be surprised when people distance themselves from you." I gave a small smile, not bitter, not challenging. "If closeness only exists when I give up my rights and my dignity, then I accept the distance." I stood, took out my wallet, and paid for my coffee. Before leaving the table, I made it clear. From now on, we will not discuss anything related to property. If we must, it will be through the lawyer. We can still wish each other happy birthday, send cards at Thanksgiving. But beyond that, I won't participate. I didn't wait for a reaction. I simply turned and walked out of the cafe, the cool afternoon air rushing against my face like a release. On the way home, I realized I had just closed a door I had always left slightly open, hoping family ties might someday change. Now, it was shut completely, not because I hated them, but because I needed to protect myself. And this time, I knew I would never go back to open it again. That evening, right after I hung my bag on the rack, my phone began buzzing nonstop. At first, I thought it was just work emails, but when I looked at the screen, I saw it was all messages and missed calls from numbers I recognized but hadn't heard from in years, distant relatives, old friends of my parents, even a few neighbors from Walnut Creek. The content of the messages was nearly identical, repeated so often I could guess the wording before even opening them. "It's just family. What's the harm in letting your sister have it? What will people think about our family when they hear what you've done?" Some were more dramatic, with hints of guilt-tripping. "Lily cried all night because of you. She's so fragile. You're being cruel to her." It didn't take long to figure out what was happening. My parents had steered the story, telling it in a way that painted me as an ungrateful, selfish person who coldly abandoned her family. In their version, I had refused to help my sister in her time of need, hoarding an extra apartment I didn't even use. Not one of the people messaging me knew that the apartment was a gift from my grandparents, left solely to me, or understood that my entire childhood and early adulthood had been worn down by the constant favoritism toward Lily. I read through every message but didn't respond right away. Experience had taught me that reacting impulsively would only lead to my words being twisted and used against me. Instead, I spent the entire evening drafting a short but weighty email addressed to everyone who had sent me a message of blame. I began with a polite greeting, then clearly stated that the Oakland apartment was legally mine, per my grandparents' will and the trust they had established, naming me as the sole beneficiary. Then I wrote something I had never shared with anyone outside a few close friends: the injustices I had endured inside a home that wore the mask of a model family. I told them about my 8th birthday, when the new bike I'd been dreaming of was handed directly to Lily. I told them about the summer scholarship to Stanford that was reallocated to pay for her piano lessons. I told them about the countless times my mother said, "You're stronger, Lily needs more support," as an excuse to ignore my needs and feelings. I didn't write with bitterness or accusation, but as if laying out the facts so they could understand this story was not as simple as my parents had made it seem. I ended the email with a clear statement: "I hope everyone will respect my personal boundaries and not interfere in my private matters. Love cannot be built on coercion or force, and family bonds should not depend on one person continuously sacrificing their own foundation of security for someone else." My tone was polite, but every sentence was firm. I wanted them to understand that I was not someone who could be publicly pushed around, and I would not allow myself to be made a scapegoat for a skewed narrative. After hitting send, I set my phone aside and felt as though I had just put down a heavy weight. I didn't expect everything to change after a single email, but at the very least, anyone who wanted to criticize me would now have to think twice, because I had brought the truth into the light. In the weeks that followed, the effects of my refusal to give in became clear. Lily had to rent a temporary apartment in a neighborhood over 40 minutes' drive from the medical school. The long commute and packed class schedule left her exhausted, and according to a few mutual friends, her academic performance began to slip. I didn't take pleasure in that, but I didn't feel guilty either. It was the direct consequence of my parents and Lily treating my decision as an obstacle to be broken, rather than a boundary to be respected. Some relatives, after reading my email and hearing different sides of the story, began to avoid taking my parents' side. They didn't openly oppose them, but they also stopped sending me accusatory messages. A few even quietly wrote, "Now I understand why you made that choice." Meanwhile, my parents' social standing in the local community began to take a hit. At a neighborhood gathering, I heard from a friend of a friend that someone had said they tried to take their daughter's property for the other one. That's messed up. For those who had long seen my family as a model of success, this revelation was like a crack that fractured the perfect image. My parents, of course, said nothing directly to me about these consequences. But I could see it. From trying to use social pressure to force me to change, they had grown quieter. Maybe they had realized that the harder they pushed, the further I would pull away, or maybe they had simply accepted that not everyone was willing to side with them once the truth had been revealed. I didn't see this as a victory, because to me, it was never a battle. It was about protecting my boundaries, and as my grandfather once told me, don't let anyone take what already belongs to you, not just your property, but your respect. This time, I had done exactly that, and I would continue to hold that principle no matter who tried to shake it. After everything that had happened, it felt as if I had cut away a boulder that had been pressing on my chest for years. No more relentless phone calls, no more veiled remarks about family responsibility, or your sister needs it more. I returned to my own rhythm, and for the first time in years, all of my energy was poured entirely into my work. I worked at an investment fund in San Francisco, where every morning I drove across the Bay Bridge, watching the city emerge with its glass towers reflecting the first light of day. The job demanded intense focus analyzing markets, meeting with clients, making decisions on multi-million-dollar investments. I loved being in an environment where my worth was measured by results, not by my role in the family or comparisons to someone else. Within just a year, I was promoted to portfolio manager with a salary and authority that allowed me complete financial independence. The Oakland apartment was no longer just a place I returned to for sleep after a long day. It became a space I wanted to care for. I changed the curtains, bought a walnut dining set, and rearranged the kitchen for cooking nights with friends. Once a month, I hosted dinner parties for colleagues and close friends, serving Italian dishes I'd learned from that small restaurant by Lake Merritt, pouring wine, and letting conversations stretch late into the night. Each time, I felt it clearly this was my territory. No one could enter without permission, and no one could decide for me. One Friday evening, after cleaning up from dinner with friends, my phone pinged with a new email. It was from Lily. I sat on the sofa and opened it. The first line was long and full of emotion. "Sis, I know things have been tense, but I'm really struggling." She wrote about the expense of renting near the medical school, her noisy roommate, and the exhaustion from commuting every day. She brought up the Oakland apartment, calling it the perfect solution for her, and ended with, "I hope you can reconsider, because we're family." I read it to the end, then closed my laptop. I didn't reply. Not because I couldn't understand the difficulty Lily was facing, but because I knew that once I gave in, everything would return to the way it was, my sacrifice taken as a given, the boundaries I had built collapsing. I had chosen to protect myself, and I wasn't going to apologize for that. In the days that followed, I still went to work, still came home, still invited friends over for dinner, and still lived in the peace I had built with my own hands. This apartment, this job, this life, they were mine, and I belonged to them, just as they belonged to me. A year after I changed the locks and updated the trust, my life was completely different. My work at the investment fund had flourished. I'd not only been promoted but also invited to speak at panels on personal finance, especially those aimed at young women seeking independence. When an email arrived from the organizers of a conference in Oakland on women and independent finance, I accepted immediately. Not just because the topic was close to my heart, but because I knew I had a story powerful enough to share. On the day of the conference, the hall was brightly lit, every seat filled with women of all ages. When the host announced my name, I walked onto the stage to warm applause, the microphone solid in my hand. I began with a simple question. How many of you here have ever felt you had to give up something that was yours, just to keep the peace with your family or in a relationship? More than half the hands went up. I smiled, knowing I was exactly where I needed to be. I told them about the Oakland apartment, my grandparents' gift, and a symbol of the safety I had guarded so fiercely. I didn't shy away from the details, the graduation night that turned into a family meeting, the demand to sign the apartment over to my sister, and my decision to change the locks and cut off my parents' access. I told them the apartment was just the surface. What truly mattered was the personal boundary it represented. If I had given in back then, I said, I wouldn't have just lost a property. I would have lost my voice and my right to make decisions about my own life. Daddy. The room was silent when I finished, then erupted into strong applause. I saw eyes glistening with tears, heads nodding in recognition. I knew that in this room, every woman carried her own apartment, whether it was a career, time, a dream, or her peace of mind, something she needed to protect from intrusion, even if it came from those closest to her. When the conference ended, I shook hands with many women, listening as they shared their own stories. By the time I stepped outside, the sun was setting, casting all of Oakland in a warm orange glow. I got into my car and headed toward the Bay Bridge. The evening wind swept in through the lowered window, tugging gently at my hair as the deep hum of jazz filled the cabin. Ahead, the last rays of sunlight danced on the water, sparkling like fragments of gold. I thought about the road I'd traveled, about the days I sat in that apartment afraid it would be taken from me, about the nights I stayed silent just to keep the peace. Now, I no longer need anyone's permission to live the way I want. I had protected my foundation of safety, and more importantly, I had learned to respect myself enough not to trade it away. If you're listening to this story and have ever been asked to sacrifice something that belongs to you just to keep an unbalanced relationship alive, remember this: that is not love, and it's not healthy connection. Real love never demands that you give up your foundation of safety. It never asks you to abandon the core of who you are just to please someone else. You have every right to protect your space, your property, your time, and your self-worth from unreasonable demands, no matter who they come from, even from the people closest to you. And, most importantly, you deserve respect, not because of what you've sacrificed, but because of who you are and what you've worked so hard to build. If my story makes you see a piece of yourself in it, I hope you find the courage to set your boundaries, to say no when you need to, and to move forward with the certainty that you are not wrong for protecting yourself. Your life is yours, and no one else has the right to decide it for you. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my story. If you'd like to keep walking this journey together, come back at the same time each day, where I'll share more true stories, lessons, and perspectives to help you grow stronger on your path to freedom and independence. I'll see you tomorrow, and until then, always remember, you have worth and you are worthy of that respect.